In the scorching summer of 1462, a macabre forest stretched across the Wallachian plains. 20,000 stakes pierced the earth, each crowned with a decomposing human form arranged in perfect geometric patterns. The stench was so overwhelming that horses refused to advance, and even carrion birds avoided the area. When Sultan Mehmed II, conqueror of mighty Constantinople and terror of Christian Europe, reached this ghastly monument, he ordered his 150,000-strong army to retreat immediately. What manner of ruler could inspire such dread that the Ottoman Empire's most feared commander would abandon a military campaign at the sight of his handiwork? Vlad III Dracula ruled Wallachia from 1456 to 1462, transforming a small principality caught between the expanding Ottoman Empire and Christian kingdoms into Europe's most feared realm. Born into an age where survival demanded constant warfare and political maneuvering, Vlad discovered something far more potent than armies or gold: the systematic weaponization of human terror. While other rulers relied on military might or diplomatic cunning, Vlad built his power on an unshakable foundation of fear that could paralyze enemies before they dared to act. In 15th century Eastern Europe, where the Ottoman tide threatened to engulf Christian lands, Wallachia existed as a precarious buffer state. Previous rulers had learned that neutrality was impossible. Survival required choosing the strongest ally and praying they would honor their promises. Yet even in this brutal age, where public executions were commonplace and torture was an accepted tool of statecraft, Vlad's methods shocked both allies and enemies alike. This is not the story of a madman drunk on blood, but the calculated rise and inevitable fall of history's most innovative architect of psychological warfare. Vlad was neither insane nor randomly cruel. He was a brilliant strategist who understood that in his world, mercy was often interpreted as weakness, and that sometimes the most effective way to prevent greater bloodshed was to commit acts so terrible that none would dare challenge his authority again. His reign poses disturbing questions that echo through the centuries. Can extreme cruelty ever be justified by political necessity? What transforms a rational human being into an agent of systematic terror? And perhaps most unsettling of all, given the right circumstances, how many of us might make similar choices? The answers lie buried in the blood-soaked soil of medieval Wallachia, where a young prince learned that power without fear is merely an invitation to destruction, and where the pursuit of absolute security led to the creation of absolute horror. Vlad III entered the world in 1431, within the stone walls of Sigishora Fortress, inheriting both royal blood and a legacy written in violence. His father, Vlad II Dracul, had earned his epithet as a member of the Order of the Dragon, a Christian military society dedicated to halting Ottoman expansion. The name Dracul meant both dragon and devil in the local tongue, a duality that would prove prophetic for his son, who became Dracula, son of the dragon. The child's earliest memories were shaped by the constant thunder of war drums and the acrid smoke of burning villages. Wallachia existed in a perpetual state of siege, its survival dependent on its ruler's ability to navigate between Hungarian ambitions, Polish interests, and the relentless Ottoman advance. Young Vlad witnessed firsthand how weakness invited destruction, how trust inevitably led to betrayal, and how political necessity often demanded the sacrifice of moral principles. The Wallachian court was a deadly chessboard where human lives served as expendable pieces. Betrayal was not merely common, it was expected. Alliances shifted with each military campaign, and rulers who displayed compassion rarely lived long enough to regret their mercy. Vlad's father had risen to power through cunning and ruthlessness, but even he struggled to maintain the delicate balance required for survival. In 1442, everything changed. Sultan Murad II, consolidating Ottoman control over the Balkans, demanded hostages from Wallachian nobility to ensure their continued loyalty, a practice as common as it was effective. 11-year-old Vlad and his younger brother Radu were selected for this honor, torn from their homeland and transported to the glittering yet dangerous Ottoman court at Adrianople. For the next 6 years, Vlad received an education that would shape his understanding of power forever. The Ottoman court was a masterpiece of organized brutality disguised as civilization. Here, amid silk hangings and marble corridors, young Vlad observed how the world's most successful empire maintained control over its vast territories and diverse populations. The Ottomans had perfected what modern scholars would recognize as psychological warfare. Public executions were elaborate theatrical productions, carefully choreographed to send specific messages to different audiences. Vlad watched as suspected traitors were slowly strangled with silk cords, a method that preserved their dignity while ensuring their deaths served as powerful deterrents. He observed how the mere reputation for extreme punishment could maintain order more effectively than actual violence, provided that reputation was occasionally reinforced with spectacular demonstrations. More importantly, Vlad learned that mercy, while personally satisfying, was often politically suicidal. He witnessed how Sultan Murad II dealt with rebellious provinces not through negotiation or compromise, but through swift, overwhelming displays of force that eliminated both the rebellion and any desire for future resistance. The young prince absorbed the lesson that in the game of power, there were only predators and prey, and that the moment a ruler showed weakness, he invited his own destruction. The education deepened when devastating news arrived from Wallachia in 1447. Vlad's father had been assassinated by local nobles who had grown tired of his balancing act between Ottoman demands and Hungarian pressure. His elder brother Mircea had been captured by Hungarian forces, tortured with heated iron stakes, and buried alive while still conscious, a fate that would later inspire Vlad's own innovations in execution methods. For the 16-year-old prince, now effectively an orphan in a foreign court, the message was unmistakable. His family's attempt to rule through traditional political methods, careful diplomacy, gradual alliance building, and measured responses to threats had ended in betrayal and horrific death. The path of moderation had proven to be a road to the grave. During his final years of captivity, Vlad began to formulate a different approach to governance. If traditional methods led to weakness and destruction, perhaps the answer lay in the opposite direction. Instead of seeking to be loved or respected, a ruler should strive to be so absolutely feared that resistance became literally unthinkable. Instead of building power through alliances and agreements, which could be broken, perhaps it was better to build power through reputation alone, a reputation so terrible that it would function as an invisible army, patrolling borders and maintaining order without requiring payment or supplies. When Ottoman forces finally released Vlad in 1448 to claim his father's throne, they believed they were installing a grateful puppet who would serve their interests faithfully. Instead, they had unleashed something unprecedented, a ruler who had learned their lessons so well that he would soon surpass his teachers in the very arts they had taught him. Vlad's first reign in 1448 lasted exactly 2 months, a humiliating lesson in the realities of power. At 17, backed by Ottoman forces, but lacking any foundation of fear among his subjects, he faced the same coalition of nobles who had murdered his father. His youth, his foreign support, and his apparent weakness made him an easy target for experienced political operators who viewed him as a temporary inconvenience. The swift overthrow taught Vlad everything he needed to know about conventional governance. Traditional political methods, building consensus, negotiating with opponents, gradually consolidating authority were luxuries he could not afford. His enemies would never give him the time necessary for such measured approaches. When he eventually returned to claim his throne, he would need a strategy that could establish absolute dominance immediately and permanently. During his 8 years in exile, Vlad refined his understanding of power and developed the revolutionary approach that would define his reign. He had observed that most rulers failed because they attempted to govern through positive incentives, rewards, privileges, and appeals to loyalty. But positive incentives could always be outbid by enemies with greater resources. Fear, however, was different. Fear was absolute, immediate, and impossible to counterbid. When Hungarian forces placed Vlad back on the Wallachian throne in 1456, he brought with him a comprehensive system designed to achieve one objective: the complete psychological domination of every person within his realm and beyond. This was not random brutality or psychopathic violence, but calculated terrorism implemented with scientific precision. The centerpiece of Vlad's strategy was impalement, but not as a simple execution method. Under his direction, impalement became a refined instrument of communication, capable of sending complex messages to multiple audiences simultaneously. The process was deliberately designed to maximize both physical suffering and symbolic impact. Victims were forced onto carefully prepared stakes, blunted rather than sharp, to prevent quick death, which were then inserted through the body with surgical precision to avoid immediate damage to vital organs. The stake would then be raised upright, allowing gravity to slowly draw the victim downward as the wood gradually worked its way through the body cavity. Death would eventually come from blood loss, organ failure, or shock, but not before hours or even flows of conscious suffering that could be heard across great distances. Vlad's executioners became masters of their craft, able to position stakes so that they would emerge from different parts of the body, each variation producing different types of suffering and different time frames for death. But the true genius of Vlad's system lay not in the execution itself, but in the display. The impaled victims were arranged in geometric patterns visible from miles away, forests of dying humanity that served as monuments to his power. Merchants traveling trade routes would encounter these displays days after the executions, when decomposition had begun, but many victims were still alive. The sight, smell, and sound of these human gardens created trauma that spread far beyond Wallachia's borders. This was psychological warfare on an unprecedented scale. Each impaled victim functioned as a message sent to multiple audiences. Potential rebels learned about the futility of resistance. Foreign enemies discovered the price of invasion. And the general population understood the consequences of disobedience. The fear generated by these displays functioned as Vlad's invisible army, patrolling his borders and maintaining order without requiring payment, supplies, or military command structures. The economic logic was equally revolutionary. Traditional rulers needed large, standing armies, extensive fortifications, and complex intelligence networks to maintain control. These resources were expensive, unreliable, and often turned against their masters. Vlad discovered that reputation alone could achieve the same results at a fraction of the cost. Yes. Fear became his most efficient administrative tool, requiring only occasional demonstrations to maintain its effectiveness. Unlike other execution methods, hanging, beheading, or burning, which were quick and could be ignored by distant observers, impalement created long-lasting displays that served as permanent warnings. The victims remained visible for weeks, their decomposing bodies serving as monuments to Vlad's power long after the initial punishment. Travelers encountering these displays days or weeks later would carry the memory for the rest of their lives, spreading Vlad's reputation far beyond his realm's borders. Vlad also employed complementary methods that enhanced the psychological impact of his primary weapon. Historical records document his use of flaying, where victims were skinned alive with instruments designed to remove flesh in strips while preserving life. He utilized boiling, where prisoners were slowly lowered into cauldrons of oil or water heated to specific temperatures that would cause maximum pain without immediate death. Crushing devices systematically broke bones, starting with extremities and working inward, allowing victims to anticipate each stage of their destruction while remaining conscious throughout the process. The systematic nature of Vlad's violence becomes clear when examining his treatment of different social classes and ethnic groups. Nobles who challenged his authority faced the most elaborate punishments, their suffering designed to demonstrate the futility of political opposition. Foreign merchants who cheated or showed disrespect were punished in ways that would be remembered and reported throughout the trading networks of Eastern Europe. Religious minorities and ethnic groups perceived as disloyal faced collective punishment designed to ensure community compliance. The genius of Vlad's approach lay in its scalability and sustainability. Unlike traditional military campaigns, which required constant resources and risked defeat, psychological warfare became more effective over time as stories spread and reputations solidified. Each successful demonstration of his methods enhanced his reputation, making future violence less necessary, while simultaneously making it more effective when employed. Within months of his return to power, Vlad had achieved something unprecedented in Wallachian history: absolute internal peace, not through love or loyalty, but through the complete elimination of any desire to challenge his authority. His subjects obeyed not because they supported his policies, but because the alternative had become literally unimaginable. The Wallachian nobility represented everything Vlad despised about traditional governance. These powerful families had spent decades playing political games that weakened the realm, switching allegiances whenever it served their personal interests, and ultimately murdering his father when his balancing act no longer suited their ambitions. They possessed the resources, connections, and experience necessary to organize effective resistance against any ruler who threatened their privileges. Vlad's solution demonstrated his understanding that conventional political methods would never be sufficient to neutralize such dangerous enemies. Direct confrontation would give them time to organize resistance or flee to foreign courts where they could plot his overthrow. Instead, he devised a trap so perfectly crafted that it would eliminate the entire threat in a single decisive stroke. In the spring of 1459, Vlad sent elaborate invitations to all noble families, summoning them to an Easter feast at his court in Targovishta. The invitation was presented as a gesture of reconciliation, a new ruler's attempt to heal old wounds and restore unity to the realm. The language was carefully chosen to appeal to noble pride while suggesting lucrative opportunities for those who supported the new regime. The nobles arrived in magnificent procession, bringing their families and wearing their finest clothing. They expected a celebration that would mark the beginning of a new era of cooperation between crown and aristocracy. The great hall was decorated with silk banners and golden vessels. Musicians played throughout the evening, and the finest wines flowed freely. Vlad himself appeared to be the perfect host, moving among his guests with charm and apparent sincerity. During the feast, as conversations turned jovial and the wine loosened tongues, Vlad rose to address his assembled guests. He spoke eloquently about forgiveness, unity, and Wallachnia's bright future under their collective leadership. He proposed toasts to their shared prosperity and even suggested specific roles that various nobles might play in his administration. The atmosphere was one of genuine celebration and renewed hope. Then, at a predetermined signal that only his guards understood, every door in the hall was sealed simultaneously. Armed soldiers emerged from concealment behind tapestries and moved to surround the assembled nobles. The elderly aristocrats, those over 50 who were too old for manual labor, were immediately arrested and dragged outside to the courtyard, where stakes had been prepared in advance. These elder nobles were impaled within sight and sound of the great hall, their deaths serving as a horrifying preview for those still trapped inside. Contemporary accounts describe how Vlad personally supervised these executions, adjusting the angle and positioning of stakes to ensure optimal suffering while providing running commentary on their effectiveness. The younger nobles and their families, perhaps 300 people in total, were then forced to march 50 miles through mountain passes to the ruins of Castle Dracula, where they would spend the remainder of their lives as slave laborers. These aristocrats, who had lived lives of luxury and commanded armies of servants, were now compelled to perform the most menial construction work under constant threat of impalement. The psychological impact of this operation extended far beyond its immediate victims. In a single evening, Vlad had demonstrated that traditional concepts of hospitality, sanctuary, and noble privilege meant nothing under his rule. The surviving nobles who built his mountain fortress served as living reminders of his power, their aristocratic titles becoming cruel jokes as they hauled stones and mixed mortar. The Easter feast became legendary throughout Eastern Europe, establishing Vlad's reputation for elaborate treachery and absolute ruthlessness. Foreign courts began to approach Wallachia with unprecedented caution, aware that diplomatic immunity and noble rank provided no protection against a ruler who had so spectacularly violated every convention of medieval politics. Vlad's conflict with the Ottoman Empire began not with military provocation, but with a calculated escalation designed to transform a manageable tributary relationship into a total war that would serve his domestic political needs. When Sultan Mehmed II sent routine demands for increased tribute in 1460, Vlad responded by launching systematic raids across the Danube River, targeting Ottoman settlements and capturing thousands of civilians and soldiers. Rather than holding these captives for ransom or prisoner exchange standard practices in medieval warfare, Vlad created his most famous monument to terror. The captured Ottomans, numbering approximately 20,000, according to multiple contemporary sources, were impaled and arranged in concentric circles around Targovishte. The victims were positioned at different heights and angles, creating a vast geometric pattern of human suffering visible from miles away. The forest of impaled Ottomans served multiple strategic purposes simultaneously. It announced Vlad's defiance to the Ottoman Empire while demonstrating his capacity for unprecedented cruelty. It provided a powerful deterrent to potential collaborators within Wallachia, while inspiring fanatical loyalty among those who viewed him as Christianity's defender against Islamic expansion. When Ottoman forces finally reached Targoviste in 1462, they discovered this monument to Vlad's psychological warfare. Contemporary Ottoman chroniclers describe how even veteran soldiers, men hardened by decades of warfare across 3 continents, broke ranks and fled at the sites. The stench was so overwhelming that horses refused to enter the area, forcing the Ottoman command to establish their camp several miles away. Sultan Mehmed II himself, who had personally directed the systematic destruction of Constantinople and witnessed countless atrocities during his campaigns across Europe and Asia, reportedly declared that he could not make war against the devil himself. This reaction from one of history's most ruthless conquerors demonstrates the unprecedented nature of Vlad's methods. Vlad's most audacious act during this campaign was his famous night attack on the Ottoman camp. On the night of June 17, 1462, Vlad personally led a small force in a daring raid targeting the Sultan's personal tent. The attack was not designed to achieve conventional military victory. Vlad's few thousand soldiers could never defeat the massive Ottoman army in direct combat. Instead, the raid was pure psychological warfare, intended to demonstrate that even the most powerful ruler in the world was not safe from Vlad's reach. The attackers penetrated deep into the Ottoman camp, causing panic and confusion throughout the ranks. Although they failed to kill or capture Mehmed II, they succeeded in their true purpose, proving that conventional military superiority meant nothing against an enemy willing to abandon all rules of engagement. During the retreat from this failed attack, Vlad's forces captured several hundred Ottoman soldiers. Rather than holding them as prisoners for potential exchange, he ordered their immediate impalement along the road leading back to the main Ottoman camp. The victims were positioned so that their cries could be heard by the advancing Ottoman forces, who were compelled to march past their dying comrades while listening to their pleas for help. The cumulative effect of these tactics achieved exactly what Vlad had intended. Despite vastly outnumbering the Wallachian forces, the Ottoman advance slowed dramatically as commanders struggled to maintain discipline among troops witnessing horrors that exceeded anything in their military experience. Supply lines became unreliable as support personnel refused to venture into Wallachian territory, and recruitment for the campaign became increasingly difficult as word spread throughout the Ottoman Empire about the nature of warfare in Vlad's domain. The event that sealed Vlad's fate occurred in early 1462, when Ottoman ambassadors arrived to deliver the Sultan's final demands for submission. These were not mere messengers, but high-ranking officials representing the Ottoman court, sent to negotiate the terms of Wallachia's continued existence as a tributary state. When the ambassadors refused to remove their turbans in Vlad's presence, citing religious obligations that prevented them from uncovering their heads before any mortal ruler, Vlad appeared to accept their explanation with gracious understanding. He told the diplomats that since their turbans were so important to them, he would ensure they never had to remove them again. The ambassadors likely interpreted this as respectful accommodation of their religious practices. Instead, Vlad ordered his guards to nail the turbans directly to the ambassadors' skulls using long iron spikes, permanently attaching their headwear to their heads. The diplomats were then impaled while still wearing their spiked turbans, their bodies displayed prominently along the main road to Ottoman territory. This violation of diplomatic immunity, one of the most sacred principles in medieval international relations, marked Vlad's complete break with the civilized world. The murder of ambassadors was considered among the gravest possible offenses, justifying immediate military retaliation and marking the perpetrator as an enemy of all civilized nations. The historical record of Vlad's reign presents dramatically different interpretations depending on the source and intended audience. German pamphlets. Among the earliest examples of printed propaganda, portrayed him as a bloodthirsty monster whose cruelties exceeded all bounds of Christian behavior. These publications, designed for popular consumption in the Holy Roman Empire, emphasized the most sensational aspects of his methods while completely ignoring political context or strategic rationale. Hungarian chronicles offered a more nuanced perspective. While acknowledging Vlad's extreme methods, they often presented him as a necessary evil, a brutal but effective defender of Christian Europe against Ottoman expansion. King Matthias Corvinus and his court understood that Wallachia served as a crucial buffer state, and that Vlad's reputation, however horrifying, deterred Ottoman advances that might otherwise threaten Hungarian territory directly. From this Hungarian perspective, Vlad's cruelties were regrettable but understandable responses to extraordinary circumstances. His methods, while violating Christian principles of mercy and forgiveness, served the greater good of preserving Christian civilization against Islamic conquest. This utilitarian interpretation recognized that conventional political and military responses had proven inadequate against the Ottoman threat. Ottoman sources naturally depicted Vlad as a dangerous barbarian who violated all norms of civilized warfare. Turkish chroniclers described him as Kaziklu Bey, the Impaler prince, and attributed his cruelty to inherent evil rather than political calculation. Yet even these hostile accounts often acknowledged his effectiveness, describing him as a formidable opponent whose methods, while deplorable, achieved their intended results. Interestingly, these Ottoman sources sometimes revealed grudging respect for Vlad's tactical innovations. Military commanders who had faced his psychological warfare tactics recognized their effectiveness. Even while condemning their moral implications, some Ottoman military manuals from the period include discussions of countermeasures against psychological warfare, suggesting that Vlad's methods had forced the empire to adapt its strategic thinking. Perhaps most intriguing are the folk traditions preserved among the Wallachian people themselves. These oral histories, passed down through generations of peasants and merchants, often cast Vlad as a harsh, but ultimately just ruler who protected common people from exploitation by corrupt nobles and foreign invaders. According to these accounts, his violence was primarily directed at those who threatened the realm's independence or oppressed the weak. Local folklore describes Vlad as demanding absolute honesty in commercial dealings, with merchants who cheated customers facing immediate and horrific punishment. Stories tell of him leaving gold cups at public fountains to test his subjects' honesty, cups that remained untouched throughout his reign due to fear of his retribution. While these tales may be exaggerated, they suggest that his methods succeeded in creating unprecedented levels of public order. Modern historical analysis reveals achievements that contemporary propaganda often ignored or minimized. Vlad's economic reforms significantly reduced corruption in trade, as merchants feared his extreme punishments for dishonest dealing more than they valued potential profits from fraud. Commercial records from the period show marked improvements in contract enforcement and dispute resolution, suggesting that his reputation for absolute justice had practical benefits. His protection of peasants from noble exploitation appears to have improved agricultural productivity and reduced internal migration. Tax collection became remarkably efficient, as local officials understood that skimming revenues carried fatal consequences. While these improvements came at an enormous human cost, They demonstrate that Vlad's methods produced tangible benefits for those who survived them. The question of Vlad's personal motivations remains deeply complex. Contemporary accounts suggest both calculated strategic thinking and genuine sadistic pleasure in others' suffering. His elaborate tortures often served clear political purposes, deterring rebellion, eliminating opposition, and establishing reputation. But the personal attention he paid to victims' agony indicates motivations that transcended mere political necessity. Several witnesses describe Vlad dining among freshly impaled victims, apparently enjoying their suffering while commenting on their expressions and critiquing his executioner's techniques. These accounts suggest a personality that had moved beyond rational political calculation into genuine pathology, raising questions about the relationship between power, trauma, and psychological development. The pressure of Vlad's position must also be considered when evaluating his motivations and methods. Ruling Wallachia required constant vigilance against internal betrayal and external invasion. Previous rulers who had shown mercy or restraint had been murdered by their own nobles or conquered by foreign enemies. In this context, Vlad's extreme methods can be understood as desperate attempts to create the kind of absolute authority that might ensure survival in an impossible situation. His childhood experiences, witnessing his father's assassination, learning of his brother's torture, spending formative years as a hostage in the Ottoman court, undoubtedly shaped his understanding of power and its requirements. Whether these experiences justify his later actions remains a matter of historical and moral debate, but they provide essential context for understanding how a human being could develop such systematic approaches to cruelty. By 1462, Vlad's reign of terror had achieved its immediate strategic objectives while simultaneously creating the conditions for its own destruction. His systematic elimination of potential enemies had succeeded in consolidating absolute power within Wallachia, but it had also left him without reliable allies, competent administrators, or experienced counselors. The fear that made him invincible also made him dangerously isolated from the political networks necessary for long-term survival. The fundamental weakness of Vlad's system lay in its complete dependence on his personal presence and reputation. He had deliberately destroyed the traditional power structures that might have provided institutional continuity, replacing them with nothing but the certainty of his own terrible retribution. This approach guaranteed absolute obedience while he remained in power, but it also ensured that his realm would collapse the moment his authority wavered. Even Hungary, his most important Christian ally, and the power that had restored him to the throne, began to view Vlad as a dangerous liability. King Matthias Corvinus received increasingly disturbing reports from his ambassadors about atrocities that exceeded any conceivable military necessity. The Hungarian court realized that Vlad's reputation was beginning to reflect poorly on his Christian supporters, making diplomatic relations with other European powers increasingly difficult. The international isolation became complete when even hardened military commanders began refusing assignments to Wallachia. Diplomatic protocols were modified to avoid direct contact with Vlad's court, and trade relationships withered as merchants sought alternative routes that bypassed his territory entirely. The very reputation that had made him powerful was now making normal statecraft impossible. Within Wallachia itself, the system's weaknesses became increasingly apparent. Vlad had no trusted subordinates capable of independent action, as anyone demonstrating initiative risked being perceived as a potential threat. Administrative efficiency declined as officials became too frightened to make decisions without explicit authorization, leading to paralysis whenever complex situations arose. The succession question remained completely unresolved. Vlad had no legitimate heirs old enough to rule, and his methods had eliminated the experienced noble families who might have provided regency guidance. More fundamentally, his entire approach to governance was so dependent on personal terror that it could not be transferred to any successor, regardless of their capabilities or intentions. Economic problems began to emerge as the initial benefits of Vlad's extreme law enforcement gave way to the long-term costs of his isolation policies. Trade revenues declined as merchants avoided Wallachian markets. Agricultural productivity stagnated due to population losses from executions and emigration. And military expenditures increased as neighboring powers began viewing Wallachia as a threat requiring containment. The psychological toll on the general population also became evident. While Vlad's methods had initially created unprecedented public order, they had also produced a climate of paralyzing anxiety that inhibited economic and social development. Citizens became reluctant to engage in any activity that might be misinterpreted as suspicious, leading to a general decline in commercial and cultural dynamism. In late 1462, Hungarian forces captured Vlad through careful political maneuvering rather than military confrontation. His imprisonment was presented as protective custody rather than punishment. But the real message was unmistakable. Even his supporters could no longer tolerate his presence in active politics. The capture was orchestrated to appear as a rescue mission, protecting Vlad from Ottoman retaliation while actually removing him from power. During his 12 years of imprisonment, the world continued to evolve around him. The Ottoman Empire adapted its military strategies to counter psychological warfare. European courts developed new diplomatic protocols for handling extreme rulers, and Wallachia was governed through more conventional means. The international system had essentially immunized itself against Vlad's methods. When Vlad briefly returned to power in 1476, he attempted to resume his previous approaches to governance, but their effectiveness had drastically diminished. His reputation remained fearsome, but it no longer carried the paralyzing effect it had once possessed. Potential enemies had learned to adapt to psychological warfare, and the general population had discovered that survival was possible even under extreme tyranny. His death in battle later that year was almost anticlimactic, the end of a ruler whose methods had once shaped the politics of an entire region, but who had ultimately been rendered obsolete by his own success. The man who had discovered how to weaponize fear had learned too late that fear alone cannot sustain power indefinitely, and that even the most effective tyranny eventually destroys the foundations upon which it rests. Vlad's influence on subsequent history extends far beyond the borders of 15th century Wallachia, providing a template that would be studied, adapted, and implemented by authoritarian rulers throughout the centuries. His fundamental discovery that systematic cruelty could substitute for military strength, popular support, and institutional legitimacy offered a seductive alternative to conventional governance, particularly for leaders facing overwhelming challenges or existential threats. Modern dictators from Stalin to Pol Pot have employed variations of Vlad's psychological warfare techniques. Understanding that the fear generated by spectacular violence can be more effective than actual force in maintaining control over large populations. The calculated use of public executions, torture, and collective punishment to create climates of terror became a standard tool of totalitarian regimes, demonstrating the enduring relevance of lessons learned in medieval Wallachia. The transformation of Vlad from historical figure to literary character reveals humanity's complex relationship with absolute evil and our need to distance ourselves from uncomfortable truths about human nature. Bram Stoker's Dracula, while drawing inspiration from the historical Vlad, transformed him into a supernatural monster, perhaps because the reality of his human cruelty was too disturbing to confront directly. The vampire Dracula is frightening because he represents something alien and inhuman, a creature whose evil can be explained by his supernatural nature. The historical Vlad is far more terrifying because he demonstrates what ordinary humans are capable of when power is unchecked by conscience, institutional restraints, or moral accountability. His story forces us to confront the possibility that similar capacity for systematic cruelty exists within all human societies, waiting for the right combination of circumstances, opportunity, and justification to emerge. Contemporary psychological studies of Vlad's documented behavior reveal a complex interaction between strategic calculation and pathological tendencies. While many of his actions served clear political purposes and achieved their intended objectives, the elaborate nature of his tortures and his apparent personal enjoyment of others' suffering suggest motivations that transcended mere political necessity. His case has become valuable for researchers investigating the psychology of political violence, the development of authoritarian personalities, and the conditions that transform rational actors into agents of systematic cruelty. Studies of his methods have contributed to our understanding of how ordinary individuals can be inducted into systems of violence and how bureaucratic structures can facilitate mass atrocities. The historical records of Vlad's reign provide unique documentation of humanity's capacity for both inflicting and surviving extreme suffering. Accounts left by survivors offer insight into the psychological mechanisms that allow individuals to endure unimaginable torture while maintaining their sanity and humanity. Testimonies of witnesses reveal how communities adapt to living under constant threat of arbitrary violence, and how social bonds can both strengthen and fracture under extreme pressure. Perhaps most significantly, Vlad's story illustrates the fundamental paradox of effective cruelty. While his methods achieve their immediate objectives of consolidating power and deterring enemies, they also created the conditions that ultimately led to his downfall. The fear that made him powerful also made him isolated. The reputation that protected him from external threats also made him politically toxic to potential allies. The methods that eliminated his enemies also destroyed the social structures and institutional frameworks necessary for stable, long-term governance. This paradox offers crucial insights for understanding the inherent limitations of authoritarian rule. Systems based entirely on fear may appear tremendously powerful in the short term, but they inevitably undermine their own foundations by destroying the trust, cooperation, and institutional capacity required for sustainable governance. Vlad's reign demonstrates that power maintained through terror alone contains the seeds of its own destruction. In our modern world, where technological advances have made both surveillance and violence more efficient than ever before, Vlad's methods serve as a chilling reminder that the capacity for systematic cruelty remains present in human societies. The same organizational skills, psychological insights, and technological innovations that create prosperity and freedom can easily be adapted to serve purposes of oppression and terror. The digital age has created new possibilities for the kind of psychological warfare that Vlad pioneered. Social media platforms can amplify fear and intimidation across vast populations instantaneously. Surveillance technologies enable monitoring and control of individual behavior on scales that medieval tyrants could never have imagined. Modern weapon systems can inflict the kind of spectacular violence that Vlad used to terrorize his enemies, but with far greater reach and efficiency. These technological capabilities make Vlad's story not merely a historical curiosity, but an urgent contemporary warning. His methods remind us that the infrastructure of modern civilization can be turned to horrific purposes by those willing to abandon moral constraints in pursuit of power. The same systems that protect and serve us can become instruments of oppression if proper safeguards are not maintained. The enduring fascination with Vlad's story, from medieval chronicles to modern horror films, reflects our ongoing need to grapple with uncomfortable realities about power, violence, and human nature. His reign forces us to examine the conditions that allow such figures to emerge and the importance of maintaining moral boundaries even in the face of political necessity. The most disturbing aspect of Vlad's legacy may be the recognition that his cruelty was not the product of madness or irrationality, but of clear-eyed assessment of political reality, combined with willingness to pay any moral price for survival and success. His methods worked because he understood human psychology better than his contemporaries. Recognizing that fear could be more effective than affection, that reputation could substitute for military strength, and that the threat of extreme punishment could maintain order more efficiently than complex legal systems. This calculated nature of his cruelty makes it more rather than less frightening, as it suggests that similar methods could be deliberately chosen by rational actors who conclude that the benefits outweigh the moral costs. Vlad's story serves as a permanent reminder that the price of civilization is eternal vigilance against those who would trade human dignity for political expedience, and that the capacity for both great evil and great resistance to evil lies within every human society. The question that haunts every examination of Vlad's life, whether he was born a monster or created by circumstances, touches on fundamental issues about human nature, moral responsibility, and the malleability of conscience under extreme conditions. The historical evidence suggests neither inherent evil nor complete victimization by circumstances, but rather a complex transformation process that reveals disturbing truths about human adaptability. Vlad was not born displaying signs of pathological cruelty. Contemporary accounts of his childhood describe an intelligent, observant boy who displayed typical princely qualities: courage, curiosity, and natural leadership abilities. His transformation into history's most systematic practitioner of psychological terror appears to have resulted from a devastating combination of early trauma, political necessity, and the gradual erosion of moral constraints under pressure. This transformation raises profoundly unsettling questions about the rest of us. If a rational, educated individual like Vlad could be shaped by his experiences into something monstrous, what does this say about human nature more broadly? Are we all capable of similar transformations under the right combination of pressure, opportunity, and justification? The uncomfortable answer suggested by historical analysis is that we probably are. The effectiveness of Vlad's methods, even as we recoil from their brutality, challenges our fundamental assumptions about morality and political necessity. His reign achieved its stated objectives with remarkable efficiency. Domestic opposition was eliminated. Foreign invasions were deterred. Corruption was reduced, and political stability was maintained for over a decade. These successes were purchased with enormous human cost, but they were genuine successes nonetheless. This recognition forces us to confront difficult questions about the relationship between means and ends in political life. Can extreme cruelty ever be justified by extraordinary circumstances? Is it possible that Vlad's methods, however horrifying, prevented even greater suffering that would have resulted from continued political chaos and foreign conquest? These questions have no easy answers, but they demand serious consideration rather than reflexive moral condemnation. Perhaps most troubling is the recognition that Vlad's approach to governance was not irrational or counterproductive in the short term. His methods worked precisely because they addressed fundamental aspects of human psychology that remain unchanged across centuries. Fear remains a powerful motivator. Reputation continues to influence behavior, and the threat of extreme consequences still deters unwanted actions. These psychological realities make Vlad's techniques permanently relevant rather than historically obsolete. The story of Vlad the Impaler ultimately serves as both historical documentation and contemporary warning. It reminds us that the capacity for systematic cruelty remains present in all human societies, that the technology and organizational methods we celebrate can be turned to horrific purposes, and that the moral constraints protecting human dignity require constant vigilance to maintain. In remembering Vlad's victims and understanding his methods, we honor both the memory of those who suffered and our obligation to prevent such suffering from occurring again. His legacy teaches us that while fear may be an effective short-term tool of governance, it inevitably destroys the moral foundations upon which lasting power must rest. The true measure of political success lies not in the elimination of enemies or the accumulation of power, but in the creation of systems that protect human dignity and promote genuine security for all citizens. The monster that Vlad became warns us about the monster that potentially lurks within all of us, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. Our responsibility is to recognize this potential and build safeguards, legal, institutional, and moral, that prevent such transformation from occurring. In understanding how one man's pursuit of absolute security led to the creation of absolute horror, we learn invaluable lessons about the price of civilization and the eternal vigilance required to preserve it.